What's up, guys? It's Rowan
and Brooklyn
here from Artismart TV with another episode of #Help, the HSC English Lit Program. Now, in today's episode, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be diving in to explore Sylvia Plath's poem Birthday Present. Now, where this sits is it's part of HSC Advanced English Module A, Textual Conversations, and this is actually part one of a two-part episode, where in our second episode, we're also going to be looking at Ted Hughes and the poem Red. Because Textual Conversations as a module involves looking at two separate texts and the conversation that they have. Now, before we dive in and actually look at what good analysis is and teach you how to actually analyse Sylvia Plath's poem Birthday Present, I want to sort of just pause for a moment and ask Brooklyn, how do we think about even selecting ideas to explore when we're analysing, when we have two texts and it's part of a pair and we're needing to look at conversations between the two of them?
Yeah, so I think that there's two sets of really key principles to look at there. So the first set of principles is the idea of context, audience, and purpose. And those are really key because what they're going to help to do is establish our second set of principles, which is resonances and dissonances. So basically, I think when you're trying to develop a thesis for textual conversations, what you want to do is you want to think about, well, first of all, your thesis might be around some sort of resonance between the two texts. It might be some idea that they both deal with, because obviously you need to link your essay together in some way. So yeah, you want to look at something that's similar between the two texts. But in that, you also want to look at a key dissonance, and that's where context, audience, and purpose are going to come in, because you're going to be thinking about, well, why is Plath different to Hughes because of Plath's context? Like, Plath has written one thing because of her context, her audience, and her purpose. And Hughes has written another thing because of his context, his audience, and his purpose. So I think structurally what your thesis is going to look at is saying something along the lines of, well, there's this really good key idea that they're both looking at that's the same and it's resonant with each other, but then there's also these really key disparities between both of the texts as well, based on the context, audience, and purpose. So
amazing. So first step really before you're sort of really doing the deep dive into the analysis is really getting clarity on context, purpose, and audience for each of the separate texts. And then from there starting to frame what are the resonances and dissonances that might exist. And particularly, as Brooklyn shared, that's going to be particularly important for the dissonances that are identified. So now that we've got a bit of a sense of these two sort of frameworks that we might use to start selecting our ideas, the next step then, of course, is actually analysing the poems themselves in relation to these ideas that we might be unpacking. So what does good analysis actually involve before we actually dive in and deconstruct Plath's Birthday Present?
Yeah, great. And it's really important that we sort of, before we do any piece of analysis, are reminding ourselves of our two key steps for good analysis, which we've been looking at throughout all of our #Help episodes. So we're just going to quickly run through them now. So the first one is that you always link your technique to the idea. In linking your technique to the idea, you're really showing that step between what is the technique doing, what is the effect of the technique, really sort of focusing in there, like why have they used that technique rather than any other technique, and then showing how that effect is linking to the idea. So we don't just want to say the technique then say the idea. We want to show that link between the technique and the idea and what the effect is. Mm-hmm. And then our second important rule for good analysis is that we're not just repeating ourselves all the time, that we're making sure that every single point that we make is furthering the argument.
Yeah, you've got to see development. So just to really recap and hold us to account, guys, as we go through and actually analyse Plath's Birthday Present to see if we do this, right? Which is, one, the points we're making is furthering an argument relating to an idea. And then secondly, I think the critical thing is to actually make sure the technique links to that idea that you're furthering.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Great.
Awesome. So let's jump in and look at Birthday Present for Plath. Now, we've got a couple of examples here from the text that we're going to be unpacking. The first example...
Wait, before we go to our first example, we need to talk about what our topic sentence is going to be and what we're going to analyse overall.
And so that's good, because you've caught me out on, I think, actually something that a lot of students make the small mistake on, which is just going, great, I've got to analyse this thing and find a bucket load of techniques, and that's going to be critical to how well I go in this. And actually, yeah, it's helpful, but we need to first orientate with, well, what's the idea?
If you don't have an idea to hook your analysis to, then you're not really doing like proper analysis that you should be doing for English.
That's right, exactly. So what is the idea?
Cool. So I guess thinking about that idea of the resonances and dissonances between the text, I guess The main resonance that we're going to be looking at with Plath and Hughes in this 2-episode series is the idea that both of them talk about how Plath views the world in dramatic binaries. Right, so
what is a dramatic binary? Maybe let's just unpack that for a tick,
that's
right?
a great question. So I guess a dramatic binary is, rather than seeing the world as neutral or normal, you're seeing the world in extremes. For example, you might see something as hideous, or you might see something as like transcendentally beautiful, but you're not going to just see it as okay or nice. So if you're seeing the world in dramatic binaries, everything's a really big deal.
So I guess, does this mean then that Plath is always seeing things as, that amazingly good and horribly bad? And isn't therefore able to really recognise the complexity that exists?
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. And I think that's basically Hughes' perspective. I think Hughes doesn't see Plath as somebody who does recognise complexity. But when we do go in and really deeply analyse Plath's poetry, it's not that she's saying something is either good or either bad. She's saying a lot of the time, she's saying one thing can be both. And I guess the point is, rather than saying that something is okay, she's saying it's simultaneously both terrible and wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it's true that there's sort of a lack of nuance there. You might say we're not looking at things in a very neutral way, but yeah, she's definitely able to see the multifaceted nature of things at the same time. So basically, Plath has her own perspective on this idea of the dramatic binaries, and I think her perspective on this is that she sees these dramatic binaries as two things that can exist within the same object or within the same thing. Whereas that's going to be quite different from what Hughes believes, and we're going to look at that in the next episode. But yeah, let's jump into our first example.
Amazing. And I think what we've got to do here is have an example that therefore starts to showcase how Plath does view the world in these dramatic binaries. Mm-hmm. And I think we can see this here in a couple of examples, because we see one of them is, bones or a pearl button. Now, what's happening here in this example?
Yeah, cool. So bones and a pearl button are obviously two things that are very different to each other. I hope you can see that. And with bones, we have this sort of dark imagery. It sort of represents death. But a pearl, on the other hand, is quite beautiful. It's quite exquisite. It's a nice image. So I guess, what we see there is, I guess they're both like quite dramatically, like a bone is a very dramatically dark image, whereas a pearl is like this sort of symbol of something really valuable and something really beautiful. So putting them right next to each other, and also because they're both white, it sort of makes a nice juxtaposition, right?
Definitely.
Putting them next to each other is able to sort of showcase this idea that she's looking at this birthday present, because this poem that we're talking about is about a birthday present that she's received and hasn't opened yet, and she's questioning what is in this present. So this sort of questioning, is it a pearl or is it a bone, shows how she doesn't think that it's just like a nice, I don't know, a hair clip. Like she there's no consideration that this present could be a box of chocolates. Like it's either like she's received a bone or she's received like a pearl necklace or something beautiful like that.
And I think that leads nicely to then the next sort of example here that supports this, which is just her questioning of, is it ugly, is it beautiful? Which I think goes to that point that you're making about this sort of real lack of nuance, right? Like it's either at one extreme or the other. It isn't the box of chocolates, which is just nice. And so she really is viewing this. So we can see that we've got these, not just one, but a couple of juxtapositions between really clear polar opposites that's really showcasing, this dramatic binary. And I think it's important to note that we also see the heightened emotion here. Mm-hmm. Ugly, beautiful. It's not, comparisons of things. The words that she's using are very strongly connected, I think, with an emotional response at either end of the extreme. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's example one. Is there anything more that you would say here before we move on and look at the next example to further our argument?
No, I think that's really great what we've got there. So I think now what we have on the flip side of that is, because she views her world in these extreme binaries, she really hates ordinary things. I think she would probably hate a box of chocolates more than she would hate death. Being her, because this is sort of what she ends up implying throughout the poem, that like this birthday present that she's received is actually death. And we'll get that a bit later on. So we've got a quote here.
Yeah, we do, which is measuring the flour, cutting off the surplus, adhering to rules, to rules, to rules. So I think there's a couple of interesting things going on here that I think perhaps on first reading probably doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense.
And before you jump into that, I just want to mention that this quote is like she's imagining what the present is saying about her. So she's sort of imagining the present mocking her, thinking that this present that's sitting on her kitchen table or something, what is it thinking of her?
Mm-hmm. That's right. And I find it interesting though, because at the same time, in a prior example, the prior example we listed, we talk about this, dramatic binary of bones or a pearl button. But then what she's implying here, to some extent, right, is that this gift is going to be something really banal. Right? Like in terms of...
Well, she's implying that the gift is seeing her as something really banal. So the gift is this incredible, either transcendental or like deathly thing, but she's worried, she's self-conscious about herself, seeing the gift as...
And I think that's an interesting leap though to make. I think it's an interesting leap to make in the sense that if someone's given you something at either end of an extreme, my take on that is that their perception of you is not that you're average and ordinary.
Yeah.
Right? That you're probably a little crazy or awesome.
But I think that's
and it's interesting, yeah.
I think that's speaking to her biggest fear. Her biggest fear is being ordinary. So she's sort of imagining what this present is thinking about her, saying, oh, you're measuring the flour, cutting off the surplus, you're adhering to rules, you're pathetic. That's basically the gist of it. You're so ordinary. And yeah, I think that's really speaking to her fear of that. So we've got some techniques there. What are the techniques we've got?
So I think one, there's definitely a lot of domestic imagery. The measuring of the flour, the cutting off the surplus is really a call to, being in the kitchen, right?
Absolutely.
And baking. In this case, it's probably bread or cakes,
yeah.
Right? So we've got domestic imagery, which I think is something that she's not necessarily that comfortable with, because I think there's also a connection with domestic imagery and gender roles, particularly at the time. Okay?
Absolutely.
And one of the things that Plath isn't very comfortable with is, the, I guess, traditional gender role of, a woman in the house, in the kitchen.
Yeah, and being a mother and all those, like, obviously, this is another big thing that comes out in her poetry. Like, she loves her children, but she really struggles with being a mother and being forced into those gender roles that society is thrust upon her.
And so you see that here, that she feels that that's how the people view her, through that exact gender role, using the domestic imagery. Now, it does more. What else does this do?
Well, I think what ends up happening with this quote is it ends up, like the present ends up at the end of this sort of rant that they have about how they see Plath. They end up saying, my God, what a laugh. So that's just really emphasizing that idea that, I guess, the derogatory language, which is a technique you can use, derogatory language of my God, what a laugh, is really just emphasizing how that idea that the present is mocking her and she thinks that being ordinary is a really mockable thing.
Now, I think what goes to emphasize the sort of ordinariness of her life is also the repetition, right? It's a simple sort of technique, but it's certainly here in terms of the repetition of, to rules, which I think really goes to accentuate the idea of just the ordinariness, the banality of her life. And to some extent, I think also, though, her fear of the constricting nature of the gender roles that people might perceive her through, right?
And obviously, like, a repetition of the word rules is sort of emphasizing that monotony as well, right? Like, rules are something that are really monotonous. At least that's what I think. So
good to know. Awesome. So now let's move on to the next example that we have here.
Okay.
And this example is, and I always mispronounce this word, the veils. Is that the correct way?
How else would you say that word?
I don't know. Confuse it with veal that you eat. The veils were killing my days. Now, what's going on here? What's this about? What's the context?
Yeah, great. So she sort of uses the term veil in a few different places in this poem to mean different things. So at the beginning, the veil is the wrapping paper for the present. And so, yeah, it basically just has the functional role of being the thing that wraps the present. But later on, the metaphor of the veil ends up being something that I think is more a veil over her. And obviously, a veil has like death imagery, like you wear a veil to a funeral. It also has wedding imagery, obviously. So it's a very sort of loaded image. But I think what's actually going on here is a veil is something, if you put a veil in front of your eyes, you can't see clearly anymore. And Plath loves seeing the world in extreme amounts of clarity and, as we've said, with really strong emotion. So I feel like to Plath, a veil is something that sort of stifles her from experiencing this emotion, so potentially her domesticity. So that's why she has quite a negative view of this veil here, because she says that they're literally killing her day. So it's almost, I guess if we read into that metaphor, it might be the idea that her domesticity is killing her.
And
it's a bit of a stretch, but does that make sense?
It definitely. And I think we see that because the metaphor of the veil just becomes darker, right? She references carbon monoxide, which is, deadly to human beings.
And I think that's actually how she ended up killing herself in the end. So, yeah.
So, we certainly see that, there is this ongoing sort of connotation of death that's starting to really be expressed a lot more clearly through, the veil itself, carbon monoxide is the next one, but then beyond that, right, we've also got where she's sort of trying to subvert, I think, some of the negative connotations that we would typically associate with death, stating, that she sweetly breathes in the carbon monoxide. And it's interesting because clearly what's happening here is that, she's viewing death as, the escape from the sort of living death that she's having, the banality of her day-to-day life.
And her domesticity and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
That's right, exactly. And so I think what is, happening is she's unfortunately because this is not true, right, that depicting suicide as something that's beautiful rather than tragic.
Yeah, and I think that just sort of speaks into our whole thesis that it's like one of the most tragic things that can happen in the world, she simultaneously views as something glorious and beautiful. So,
which highlights to some extent, I think your point that, maybe it's not as simplistic in this, this sort of dramatic binaries as we might like to believe. Like, there is some complexity there. There's an idea that to hold two simultaneously conflicting ideas in one's mind at the same time is actually what complexity is. And so to some extent, I think that's where, as we start looking at Hughes and Red and his perspective on Plath in our second episode, that sort of dialogue is going to become more interesting, right? Into, okay, how does Hughes view Plath, and actually is that necessarily true? Because I think there is some complexity here that is emerging. So, final example.
So we have the idea that this sort of two dramatic binaries being held at the same time, this is very much reinforced by the fact that once she decides that the present, or she says if the present is death, then there would be a birthday. So what that's doing is it's sort of drawing back to that idea that we see in a lot of Plath's poems of this sort of intrinsic connection between death and rebirth. So if you die, that death is sort of going to lead to some sort of rebirth or spiritual rebirth or something along those lines. And that very much connects to Lady Lazarus, if you remember that poem. And at the end of that, what ultimately happens is she dies, she's in ashes, there's all this depressing stuff that happens, but then at the end she rises up with red hair and eats men like air. So, yeah.
I think just before we sort of continue on this, I think what I also find interesting, and we didn't talk about it in the prior example because I wanted to sort of highlight it here, is that a veil actually as well in the case of marriage and death is often as well actually the thing that separates one from one part of life, and it's a transition to the next, right? In the sense of, in a wedding, right? It's this idea of you're transitioning, if we go back to perhaps more conservative views of marriage, from one family to another. And in the case of death, right, it's literally a veil where you're going from life to afterlife. And so I think it's interesting that almost is sort of foreshadowing the use of the veil throughout, this sense of this transition that she's wanting to make, and this rebirth ultimately that is implied by her sort of perspective that if it was actually death, it would be a birthday or a rebirth really that's happening.
Yeah, so I think, again, that really hits home that point that we've been trying to make, that we have these dramatic binaries here. We have death and birth, literally opposites, right? But she sees them as intrinsically connected, because if you die, then there is a rebirth that comes with that death. So I think that sort of is almost the epitome of everything that she's, or I guess all these ideas that we've been talking about in her poem.
Excellent. So we've now sort of covered these examples, and just to hold us to account, I think one of the things that we've really been trying to do here, okay, is advance our idea. Remember, that was the first sort of rule of good analysis, right? It was advance the idea. And the idea that we've started with is that Plath sees the world through these dramatic binaries due to a heightened sense of emotion, and we've shown that. But then as we've progressed, what we've shown is that, well, is it actually just through dramatic binaries? Is it that that's just a simplistic look, or is there inherently more complexity to it? And that's really what we've been trying to highlight as we've progressed through here. And have we met the second criteria as well of linking our techniques to the ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been some really cool moments where we've been able to look really deeply into a metaphor and what the metaphor's doing, or in terms of the veil, like what the symbolism of the veil is, and then shown how that ultimately links to our overall idea. Excellent.
So guys, note this is part one of a two-part, because remember that textual conversations does involve you looking at a paired text. In this case, it's Hugh's poetry, and looking at those resonances and dissonances. And so what we will be doing is stay tuned for part two of this series, where we will then look at the poem Red by Hughes, and look at how there are resonances and dissonances with the same sort of ideas that we have been, or some of the similar ideas that we have been exploring in today's episode. So if you have any questions about Plath or Hughes and Module A, Textual Conversations, leave them in the comments below. We'd love to help you on your HSC English journey with what is probably one of the more challenging modules, because you've got two texts that you really need to consider.
There's just so much you need to do all at once and juggle audience, context, purpose, resonances, dissonances, two texts. There's a lot going into Module A, so we really feel for you guys. But hopefully this is helpful.
That's right. So leave us a comment, and of course, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, because we will be bringing you lots more in the following weeks, both episodes on #help, as well as all sorts of other video content. So we will see you next week.